Alex dropped off. I'm going to take the reins of this. I thank everyone for joining us today. We have a really exciting time here, and I was going to talk anyway before Peter introduced our folks. But NIDS has been working diligently at working toward making a difference in the nuclear deterrence arena. And one of those areas is to look at the future of deterrence and how we can work in this, what I'll say, a very changing, dynamic world atmosphere. And so what we're doing is developing ideas for better deterrence theory to impact strategy and policy as we go forward in this rather interesting world. And so before I see Peter made it back. So Peter, I didn't know if you had anything more to do. Why don't you go ahead and do your normal introductions? I sort of paired up everyone and queued you up. So go ahead, Peter.
Well, thank you. I want to welcome Curtis and Adam, who are my bosses and co-founders and vice presidents of this wonderful organization. I'm not going to read their bios. They're two of the most knowledgeable people in the nuclear deterrence business. And I do want to just mention Curtis was at the National War College for many years. I was there for 22 years, and they're both going to have extraordinary things to say today. I just want to mention a few things. We are planning in September to have Uzi Rubin from Israel to come talk to us. I'm talking to Admiral Week and Admiral Wolf, both from SSBN office and the SSP office, to join together to come speak to us. Frank Miller has agreed to speak, and I'm trying to get John Harvey to give us an overall perspective of where are we in the nuclear business in terms of the challenges for the next administration. And we're looking to we have scheduled Mr. Walter from the Department of Defense. He's going to speak on November 18th at breakfast at the Capitol Hill Club at 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning. Invitations will go out on that. And we hope to have General Hyten when he is free, as he told us in October, to also schedule him for a Zoom seminar. So I'm going to just turn it over to Adam and Curtis, whoever wants to go first, and to talk to us about the new paradigm they're talking about, how to look at nuclear deterrence and how to make it flexible over time. Over to you, Curtis. Unmute yourself, sir.
All right, technology here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Welcome all to this event. We here at NIDS are very proud to have you all here, and especially very proud to have Peter Huessy on our team, and being able to play our role as we continue to offer new ideas to make the world a little safer. I'm going to open up today with just a little bit, some prepared remarks just to sort of introduce dynamic parity and what it was. And then I'll pass it over to Adam, who can maybe add some more clarity, and then we'll take your questions. We're very excited about that. So I'll just get started here and start rolling. So in an evolving global strategic environment, the United States faces an unprecedented national security challenge. Aggressive and revanchist states like Russia, China, and North Korea are rapidly expanding their nuclear capabilities and numbers, while Iran is swiftly gaining an initial nuclear capability. The increasing interest and ability of these nations to cooperate, coordinate, and indeed collaborate could potentially lead to a scenario where America has to deter all of its nuclear adversaries simultaneously. The failure of deterrence could result in America facing multiple nuclear adversaries united with a collective nuclear force that is 2 to 3 times larger than ours. The situation could have catastrophic or even existential consequences. While this may be the worst-case scenario, the traditional approach to American nuclear deterrence is increasingly inadequate to confronting these arising threats. Historically, nuclear deterrence has been central to preventing both nuclear and large-scale conventional wars. However, the current strategic environment is marked by these adversaries aiming to disrupt the American-led international order and reclaim perceived losses. These nations are expanding their nuclear arsenals to bolster or expand their influence, and to coerce and deter U.S. intervention in regional conflicts as they seek to realize their individual and collective interests. And finally, the failure of past arms control treaties and an inability to cajole or sanction our adversaries to the negotiating table means America must prepare to deter in a world devoid of formal arms control measures. Negotiating with war criminals, despots, and zealots may prove disappointing or even hazardous to future peace and stability. So this rather bleak picture demands a new strategy for deterrence. So this report proposes a strategy of dynamic parity as a vital and necessary shift from our business as usual behavior in maintaining global balance and ensuring the security of the United States and its freedom-loving allies and partners. We believe the adoption of this strategy is crucial in the face of the evolving global strategic environment and our adversaries' increasing nuclear capabilities, capacities, and potential for collaboration. So dynamic parity emphasizes deliberately achieving and maintaining a symmetrical nuclear balance with the collective arsenals of Russia, China, North Korea, and eventually Iran. The proposed dynamic parity strategy aims to address these issues by 1. Balancing the American nuclear arsenal against those combined forces. 2. Enhancing extended deterrence by assuring U.S. allies and that any adversarial expansion will be met with comparable U.S. capabilities and capacities, i.e., American expansion. 3. Creating a flexible framework for managing nuclear arsenals in the absence of arms control agreements. And 4. Informing nuclear force configuration and deployment in a way that maintains credibility and adaptability. So to do this, dynamic parity is a nuclear strategy that ensures the United States maintains a symmetrical balance of nuclear capabilities with its adversaries. And this balance is achieved through 3 key components. The first is capability. The U.S. must field a full spectrum of nuclear weapons and delivery systems that are roughly equivalent to those of its adversaries. Now, that does not mean matching every adversarial weapon or novel system, but this does mean matching a capability that ensures an equivalent deterrent threat. Capacity refers to the size of the U.S. nuclear arsenal that should approximate the collective arsenals of Russia, China, North Korea, and eventually Iran. This approach allows the U.S. to adjust its arsenal size in response to its adversaries' actions, reducing the need for formal arms control agreements. If their numbers go up or down, we verify and mimic accordingly. They get to decide the size of the American arsenal. And third, force composition. The U.S. nuclear arsenal must deploy an optimal mix of capability and capacity with an optimal amount of flexibility and survivability. This would include mobile systems, what I might refer to as a quadriad, hypersonics, remerving ICBMs, reinstituting quick reaction alert, advancing non-strategic nuclear weapons, applications of shorter range nuclear weapons, including short-range ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, and any other methodology that would be used to ensure stability and assist America's ability to deter any level of escalation. Dynamic parity requires the U.S. to avoid incorrect assumptions that specific American capabilities are destabilizing, while similar capabilities held by our adversaries are not. And by maintaining a symmetrical balance, the U.S. promotes stability and deters adversaries by ensuring they understand their risks from their nuclear aggression. So dynamic parity seeks to impact and communicate in 4 areas. The first is strategic stability. By maintaining a symmetrical nuclear balance, dynamic parity disincentivizes interstate violence that could escalate to nuclear conflict by matching adversaries' perceived strength and thus removing their perceived superiority. Second, addressing adversary behavior. We seek to alter their behavior by preventing them from achieving that same nuclear superiority perception. Third, allied assurance. Dynamic parity reassures U.S. allies that their security is guaranteed, reducing the likelihood of nuclear proliferation among the allied nations. In other words, we want to make sure they understand there's enough for them. And finally, damage limitation. The strategy emphasizes the importance of counterforce targeting while maintaining a secure and guaranteed second strike retaliation force, sufficient in size. In other words, we cannot allow American foreign policy to be coerced into inaction, and America must not be blackmailed into surrender after suffering a first nuclear strike. So as I wrap things up here, dynamic parity offers a rational response to the challenges posed by the collective nuclear forces of Russia, China, North Korea, and eventually Iran. Our adversaries understand strength primarily by counting the capacity, observing the capability, and assessing the composition of America's forces. By maintaining a symmetrical nuclear balance in capability, capacity, and composition, the U.S. can deter its collective adversaries, assure its allies, and preserve global peace and stability by convincing them that our matched strength and stability, and convincing them of it to, in an era here of without nuclear arms control. By achieving and maintaining dynamic parity, our collective adversaries, we do the following four things here. One, by reasonably matching adversary capability, capacity, and composition, we communicate strength and fairness without seeking American superiority in numbers. Two, by reasonably matching adversary capability, capacity, and composition, we assure an already nervous set of allies who may be seeking to alternatively garner their own nuclear security by providing them a more credible extended deterrent. Three, by reasonably matching adversary capability, capacity, and composition, we shift the burden of fear from America's shoulders onto their shoulders. Fear breeds caution, caution breeds hesitation, and hesitation breeds inaction, which leads to peace and the maintenance of the status quo. And finally, by reasonably matching adversary capability, capacity, and composition, we dynamically increase or decrease our arsenal in parity with theirs. We transfer the urgency to negotiate arms control onto the adversary. They will only come to the table when they fear an American nuclear deterrent enough. So I'll stop there, pass the mic on to my colleague, Dr. Lowther.
Hey, thanks everybody for being here today. We appreciate you taking the time out. So what I'm going to do is sort of answer the why question, and in particularly, why dynamic parity as opposed to any other options. So the way I see it is that there are essentially four options. Now, in saying that there are four options, I'm discounting disarmament as a viable option, because I think for the majority of folks, that's probably not an option anyone is seeking right now. So what I would submit to you are the four options are, and I'll say this in terms of least to most change, or least demanding of the United States to most demanding of the United States. So on the least demanding side, I would say our first option is essentially a do no more option. And by do no more, I mean maintain the modernization program that we have, where we're going to modernize, we're getting the B-21, we're getting LRSO, we're going to get Columbia, we're having some upgrades to Trident, we're going to get a new warhead. There's quite a bit going on. And so maintain the status quo and do what we're doing, but do nothing else. And that argument essentially says, well, hey, listen, we're spending $2 trillion over the course of 30 years. So that's about 6 to 7% of the defense budget. And that's sufficient. We can't afford to spend any more. How can 1,550 nuclear weapons on all these new platforms, how is that not enough? That should be sufficient. That's that argument. That's sort of the least demanding argument. And then the second argument, which is sort of one that's carrying a lot of weight, perhaps in Stratcom and in other parts of the DoD, is one called strategic sufficiency. And the argument for strategic sufficiency is that you increase the arsenal with the required types of of delivery vehicles, the types of capabilities that you need to maintain effective counterforce strategy. And so there will be a growth in the number of weapons and delivery systems, but you don't necessarily need to maintain parity. And the argument is, and it's certainly a understandable argument, and the argument is, hey, listen, we may not need, let's say if the Chinese add 300 more ICBMs, and those ICBMs are carrying, let's say, 6 to 8 warheads. Well, to kill those 300, we may only need 50 ICBMs with 50 warheads. So instead of having 300 with 8 each, we only need 50 with 50 each. And that would be strategically sufficient to both deter and employ counterforce strategy. And so therefore, strategic sufficiency requires more than the do no more, but it sort of is your next bump up the requirements ladder. And then, of course, the third in this option is dynamic parity, because dynamic parity essentially says match in broad swaths. It doesn't have to be, let's say for the Russians who might come up with a megaton class, AI enabled torpedo. We don't necessarily have to have a megaton class AI enabled torpedo, but in broad swaths, you develop the same number and types of delivery systems. You don't necessarily have to have the exact number of ICs, bombers, and SLBMs. We may choose a slightly different mix, but you maintain essential parity. And so that's, again, a step up the requirements ladder. And I would submit to you that the reason that you have that is in human psychology, there is a tremendous literature on what's called symmetry. And so, for example, when humans look at people, they make a judgment on their physical attractiveness by looking at their face. And what we know from studies is that people judge the facial symmetry, and that's how you determine whether somebody's attractive or not, is their face symmetrical. Now, that principle, while it's sort of interesting to think about how we determine whether people are attractive or not, it follows in many other aspects of how we act. We tend to hang out with people who are like us. We tend to, people of similar races congregate to each other, people of similar classes, people of, this goes on. And it's a example of symmetry. We know, like, and understand that which is like us. And so when you think about nuclear weapons, symmetry also has value, because when the Russians or the Chinese see that you have essentially similar numbers, similar capabilities, similar delivery, they understand that, and they understand the implications of it. It's when you have dramatic asymmetry, that's when things become uncertain, and that's when fear tends to creep in. And so symmetry has a value. And then it's also, for the argument for dynamic parity, the second argument I would offer you is redundancy. Now, you may or may not be familiar, here in the last probably 3 to 6 months ago, the UK had two test failures of its D5s. And so they were testing, test launches that didn't work. And so, of course, that's a problem. That's part of the reason dynamic parity says we're going to build only American capability to match. We're not going to count on the French or the British arsenals, because we don't know what we can and can't count on. And so it's this question of redundancy. While strategic sufficiency says, well, we can kill 300 with 50. Our premise with dynamic parity is that you need redundancy, because you have no clue what will and won't work because as we know from, wars past, that it's never one bullet, one kill. And so it's symmetry and redundancy. And then the fourth option is superiority. And of course, Matt Kroenig wrote a great book about superiority, and his argument, and it's an argument I think many, particularly some here, it might resonate with them, is the idea that when you have superiority, your adversary will tend to back down. This was the argument that Matt made in his book, was in the 30 plus case studies where there was a crisis between two nuclear armed adversaries, that the nuclear armed adversary with the inferior arsenal, that adversary backed down in the crisis. And so that's the superiority argument. And that's sort of, maintain superiority in all capabilities over your adversary. And that's the reason why. And it's a compelling argument. Now, of course, my preference would be that the United States is the only nuclear power. We and we alone have them, but let's say for the sake of argument, that's not going to happen. And we know that's not the world we live in. So if we cannot be the only nuclear superpower, then we have to determine what we want our capability to look like. Now, what we know from public opinion polling is that the American people fundamentally, in every single poll that we've seen, that they support the modernization of the nuclear enterprise. They support the United States having nuclear weapons. They support the United States modernizing those nuclear weapons. And they clearly see the Russians and the Chinese as a nuclear threat. That's pretty clear. And so there is support for our current modernization program. Now, the challenge lies in the fact that it seems pretty unclear and pretty doubtful that the American people will support significant sacrifice in other areas. So this is something we've looked at in public opinion polling with South Korea, is that when you pose public opinion polling in the sense of, well, if you, the South Koreans who support an indigenous nuclear arsenal, will be sanctioned, will you then support it? And then the support for that indigenous arsenal goes down. Well, what we've not seen with the American people is opinion polling in which we ask the American people, do you support a growth in the nuclear arsenal if it means, handouts are cut, or Medicare, Medicaid are cut? And what we surmise, even though we don't have hard polling data on this, is that the American people, because this is what we've tend to see in other areas, is that the American people support something so long as there's no sacrifice required. And thus far, that's largely how you look at the federal budget, and we've done a lot without making any sacrifices, which is why we have a $34 trillion budget, or $1 trillion in national debt. So there is good reason to believe that support for nuclear superiority, while people may think, yeah, that might be the best option, but as we start to balance out what you have to give and take to get there, you may see support start to decline. Now, I will say there's also the defense side. And I'd like to remind folks that there were periods during the Cold War in which Strategic Air Command received 50% of the DoD's budget, 50% for Strategic Air Command, as it was building out, an Air Force of over 600, B-52 bombers by 1991. Now, today, we're looking at a nuclear modernization program where the DoD is going to allocate 7% of its budget to nuclear modernization. So by any stretch, there's certainly room between the 7 and the 50. And so if you go from the do no more, that's where your 7% is. Strategic sufficiency may require a little more. And then even if you were to get to superiority, you probably are not going to require anywhere near 50%, but it will require more. Now, superiority, while it, like I said, could be the best approach, may be in the too hard to do category. And so part of what our objective in looking at dynamic parity was to look at what we can do, what will actually be effective in deterring an adversary, and what is feasible in the United States. So superiority may be in the too hard to do category. Now, if we go to the other end and look at the do no more strategy, it leaves a tremendous gap, particularly in whether you want to call it non-strategics, tactical, battlefield nuclear weapons. There's a gap that if we just maintain the current approach, that our adversaries see and understand that gap, because we have very few non-strategic nuclear weapons, battlefield, tactical. And the fear is that adversaries will attempt to exploit that gap and will think they can get away with the use of those. And then with strategic sufficiency, which I would submit as a better option than the do no more, they still may see a capability gap, adversaries, because you have little room for failure or for unexpected technical problems, because you're building sufficient to hold targets at risk, but you don't have that extra. You don't have the more. And there's also, at least in my mind, a question of how effective are you at achieving the psychological effect that, superiority guarantees or that dynamic parity is likely to ensure. And I would just like to remind folks that if you go back and you look at the Vietnam conflict and then the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Vietnam, for every one adversary that we killed, we expended 55,000 rounds of small arms ammunition. 55,000 to kill one. So it wasn't, one shot, one kill. And then if you go, surprisingly, I was actually surprised at this number. If you look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we expended 250,000 rounds of small arms ammunition per kill in those conflicts. So we didn't get better, we got worse. And so I would submit to you that the concept that we're going to have one shot, one kill when we start to wage a nuclear conflict, that's it's ahistorical. And so we may actually have more failures, more, adversary strikes that take out capabilities, and we may have a lot less than we plan for. And so that's a concern that I think sort of harms the logic of strategic sufficiency. And then, of course, the other option, we've talked about the three, that's dynamic parity. And I would submit what I like about it is that it forces the nation to address the capability gaps that we now have. We have capability gaps. If you read the report, we talk about the need to, essentially rebuild the manufacturing capability, the DOE and NSA complex, to where you have the capability to build the weapons. You've got to revitalize the industrial base so that you don't have, problems like we're seeing with Sentinel, and you've got to maintain and consistently replace aging systems. You don't keep them for 50 to 80 years. You replace them every 10 or 15. And by doing so, it demonstrates a commitment to your adversary that you're serious and that you're actually dedicated to this mission. And it goes along with, I mentioned the redundancy and the symmetry, but you're also reinforcing that by replacing weapons and capabilities on a regular basis. And so that's what I would submit. These are kind of your four options and their strengths and weaknesses. And when Curtis and I were looking at what should the next strategy look like, we settled on dynamic parity as opposed to any of the other options because we thought it was the best balance given the, sort of where the nation is and what we thought was achievable. And so with that, I'll stop.
Adam, thank you very much. I have 3 questions for each of you, and I want to preface why I'm going to ask them is that I look at what the global zero arms control and folks are talking about because they have some ideas that are going to get currency within the body politic. And here are the 3. The first one came out just the last week from the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was founded by and created by Dr. Oppenheimer. And he was a PhD student from Ireland. He wrote a piece that said that U.S. counterforce capability requires the United States to go first in a crisis, because the only way, he said, you could win a nuclear war is to disarm the other guy by taking everything out first. And that's that our counterforce capability and strategy is highly destabilizing. That was number one. The second thing, also from the Union Concerned Scientists, was another essay about conventional weapons are so capable that we don't need nuclear weapons anymore. And that's, he said, due to the quickness as well as accuracy. And the third is quite interesting, is the arms control wonk, otherwise known as said, quoted by The Economist, is that it doesn't make France's nuclear weapons at 300 are no less capable than America's nuclear weapons at 5,000 is the number he used. And so he basically said numbers don't matter. I take any 3 or all 3, Adam and Curtis, and kind of walk through them if you would, because I think they represent a strain of thinking that is quite not just common within the disarmament community, but gaining traction within that community. I'm not sure they're gaining traction in Congress yet, but certainly within their community they are.
Go ahead, Adam. I'll let you go first.
So I guess the first one is, I hear sort of a lot of, like, anytime I hear the word stabilizing and destabilizing, I sort of cringe because nobody ever provides a definition of what stability is, much less do they provide an empirical analysis of what stability is. So I don't know how anybody ever measures it. So when somebody says that the United States has to go first and that our, arsenal and our current strategy / policy is destabilizing, I don't know what that means because I have nothing empirical to look at. It's just sort of it's a throwaway that there's no way to effectively measure. So I can't really speak to it because it isn't based in any sort of empirical fact or provided any demonstrable evidence that I can then evaluate and say, yes, that's good evidence, or no, it's not. So I don't know what to say about it because it's ideology more than anything. Did you want to jump on that one as well?
So I think, strategic stability really is, I guess by observation, is when you can create a climate where nations are reluctant to go to war with one another, or to say have no conflict is probably a bit of a reach, but to go to war with one another. And the escalatory effects and the fear of that is what has largely kept the peace for the last 75 years. And that is the one value of nuclear weapons. And it is one of the reasons why, to the second question from Peter, why conventional weapons can't do it. When we look at conventional weapons, we look at the idea of how much it might be. Adam and I talk about this all the time. We ask ourselves, what do the Russians fear more? Or for that matter, the Chinese or the North Koreans? Do they fear America's nuclear arsenal, or do they fear America's conventional warfighting prowess? And which do they fear more as far as intent? That America has a greater intent to obliterate another nation, or does America have an intent to regime change national governments it doesn't like? I would submit that we have a pretty good amount of credibility in regime changing organizations, and our conventional prowess is well proven. My argument here is that it is America's conventional might and its behavior over the last 20 plus years that has largely driven Iran to nuke up, North Korea to nuke up, and other nations to think about it. And that is not driven by our nuclear issues. It's in the shadow of our nuclear arsenal for sure, in the stability paradigm. But the reality here is that nations are nuking up, and they're enhancing their nukes because of the fear of our conventional capability. It is perhaps more provocative. Now, the other I'll answer to that, I'll say here in that second question is that if you look back at the crystal ball effect that Stephen Waltz talked about back in the day, it's much more a national leader who's thinking about going to war is much more fearful of that image of mushroom clouds going off over their country than whether or not any conventional weapon can. In other words, a conventional war, most adversaries are going to think there's a possibility I can survive that. But in a nuclear exchange, most national leaders will think, I'm not sure I can survive that. And therefore, that breeds that hesitation and caution. And then the amount of money. The amount of money spent on our conventional arsenal is huge. And if you wanted to replace the yield amounts of our nuclear with the yield amounts of conventional, you would spend hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars more and create a force necessary that would be so provocative in order to accomplish that it would be a challenge in and of itself. So I'm not sure that those are the right ways to go in that regard. I'll pass it back over to you, Adam.
Yeah, I would submit. I just posted in the meeting chat. I posted a PDF. It's a link to a PDF, and it's an article that James McHugh and I wrote. It's an article where we looked at this argument of tactical precision guided munitions, PGMs, versus nuclear weapons. And, we sort of evaluated the strengths and weaknesses of each. And one thing I would tell you is we simply don't have the capability or the funds to manufacture, the required. Let's suppose we bought the argument of we could do it all with PGMs, which we can't. We don't have enough. We don't have the aircraft to deliver those PGMs. We don't have the PGMs themselves. We looked at, for example, an airfield, and that airfield would have required 80 conventional weapons to dropped on that airfield to ensure destruction. But it would have taken, 3 to 4 low yield nuclear weapons. Well, delivering 3 or 4 low yield nuclear weapons is a lot easier and a lot cheaper than ensuring, 80 weapons are delivered. So it's also a practical issue and an issue of, our magazines don't have the depth, and they're not going to have the depth to do what anyone wants. You have to have nuclear weapons. And then there was a third question, Peter. What was your third question?
300 French weapons. Sufficiently.
Yeah, I mean, numbers matter. I mean, that's like I don't know where you would come up with an argument that numbers don't matter, because, these are not just political weapons. I mean, deterrence is achieved because you're prepared to nuclear war fight. You have to prepare to fight and win a nuclear war. And the happy byproduct of that, prior preparation is that you achieve deterrence. And so if you look at warfare in, sort of any element, numbers matter. Numbers of troops, numbers of weapons, numbers of air, it always matters. So it's only when you think of nuclear as, having its own set of rules, its own logic, its own, where nothing we know about warfare applies. That's the only time and place in which numbers might not matter.
And we have a question here from Kirk Pashner, and I'll pass it over to him to.
All right. Thanks, gentlemen. And I'm not so sure it's as much a question as sort of a comment on, especially the argument the Irish author brought up that Peter mentioned, and it's been brought up many times. And the thing that I point to is what I call the Gottmuller-Cartwright paradox. Okay. In 2010, Vladimir Putin told us what he feared. He feared an asymmetry between our exquisite conventional capability growing to the point where it put his strategic forces and his leadership at risk without having to resort to nuclear warfare. And for that reason, he had to maintain his non-strategic nukes as a hedge against that. So when we talk about what works, what deters, we have to put our head in the mindset of the opponent. And too often the opponent has told us exactly what they're concerned about. We've ignored it and done exactly what they're concerned about. And I think Rose Gottmuller is my favorite punching bag, I guess, in that she, even in the SPR, comes out and says, we need to think more about replacing nukes with conventional capabilities that do the same thing, regardless of what she was told by the negotiators in New START in terms of how Russia viewed that. And they just don't seem to be able to get it. So I guess within the realm of dynamic parity, I would be concerned that we don't try and achieve parity in a way that exacerbates our enemy's thinking.
All right. Thanks, Kurt.
Adam, I have a question from Aaron Holland in the chat function. It says, does dynamic parity address credibility of use concerns with U.S. leadership that exhibits a taboo against nuclear first, in particular U.S. presidents that may adopt such a taboo that they just aren't going to go first?
I would submit that, dynamic parity isn't necessarily designed to overcome the taboo. The hope is that by virtue of building a, pure force, that you never end up using it because you're ready to employ when necessary. And I don't think any U.S. president, Republican or Democrat, I don't know that it really matters, is going to be willing to go first. But I think regardless of who that president is, whether they're dovish or hawkish, once the United States or its overseas allies and assets, if they're struck by nuclear weapons, I think dovishness tends to go away. And so if you look at historically which presidents have been willing to use force in conflict, it tends to be the ones who are elected as dovish presidents. They tend to be willing to go out and use force more frequently. The ones who are more hawkish in prior practice or in speeches, they tend to be the ones who use it less. So like you can take a look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a very hawkish sounding candidate, and then he ended up, he was one of the only presidents who's never started a conflict. So I don't necessarily know that there's a direct correlation to any of that. I would just say the the gloves come off once an adversary starts using it, and you don't quite know who's going to be the one to say, fire them all, just use one. We don't quite know that.
I'll just add to that, the nuclear taboo terminology, idea, concept, however you want to couch it, to me is antithetical to the goal of credibility. If we continue to talk about a nuclear taboo, that it should, American nuclear weapons must never be used, a war must never be fought, these sorts of ideas, it really goes to depressing credibility. And when you depress credibility, you actually create the very scenario that you're trying to deter against. So, in order for deterrence to succeed, you must be credible. And I submit that one of the reasons why America is credible is because we're still writing on our history from 1945. Being the only country to employ atomic weapons in conflict, we're deemed to be credible in that regard. And so we have to be careful, I think, in how we apply these taboo terminologies. And we must not use those as excuses to sort of rational way what we think our adversaries might do. Oh, Putin will never violate the nuclear taboo. Therefore, we don't need to prepare for it or think about it. That goes to minimalist thinking, and I think sets the nation up for failure in that regard.
I think we had another question.
I see Dr. Karshner's got a hand up.
Yeah, I could pass the mic over to him. I'll go ahead and do that.
Okay.
It's over to you, Carrie.
And you're still muted.
So he has mic access.
Oh,
It's
okay.
up to him to unmute on his end.
Yeah, Kerry, go ahead and unmute and we will listen. We'll hear what you have to say.
Okay, he might be having technical issues here.
I think
right.
Chris Bosquion asked a question earlier where he says, is it correct to reckon that dynamic parity should be an encouragement to allies to not independently proliferate nuclear weapons for those in Europe and Asia which don't have any yet? Well, yes, it should. That's part of our that's part of our objective with it, is to ensure that the United States has, by virtue of having the ability to cover all of our adversaries collectively, that the U.S. alone has the collective capability to match all adversary capabilities across Russia, China, North Korea. Part of that objective is so that the allies say, well, we don't need it because the Americans are willing to build it, and if they're willing to build it, we think they're willing to use it if necessary.
Yeah, and I would add to that if we don't pursue a dynamic parity style of strategy, then our allies and friends will proliferate. And in fact, we ought not get in the way of that. Perhaps what we call, what we hear in NIDS referred to as nuclear participation by first world responsible nations, may be the requirement to fill in the gaps that America is unwilling or unable to do. Even if it pursues strategic sufficiency, it may not be sufficient enough for allies.
Yeah. What was that old adage? It's 5% to deter and 95% to assure the allies.
Sure, that's correct.
Yeah. I think Carrie's put a note in that says he's unmuted on his end. So Alex,
okay.
He has mic access, but it's coming up showing muted on his end.
Okay.
Because he does have permission to unmute himself, but it's not.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions then? Or Carrie can type his in. Jim, you have a question?
Yes, I do. While we're waiting on Terry, and if he gets back in, we'll go ahead and go with that. But I always look at this. You guys always call on me for the technical aspect of this, and one of the technical things that happened, and I put in the Q&A, is that we had this great peace dividend we got in the 1990s. We turned everything down. Everyone followed us because we all reduced our nuclear capabilities, and everything else in the world followed along, and we have peace and stability, except for now. So. In the view of dynamic parity, you guys talk about this in the paper. I just like maybe a little more comment. Is that we now, with dynamic parity, can maintain our capabilities. And I'd like to hear that from a strategic standpoint, also from a technical standpoint, because our technical capabilities atrophied, and there's a long lead line. And we're talking about 2035 and 2050 before we start having our ability to build our forces. Our nuclear capability, increase our numbers. It's hard to build nuclear weapons. You can't just go out there and pull one out of the bucket, although we do have the hedge. So I'd be interested from a dynamic parity standpoint how that's done mechanically.
Well, you're going to have to, exercise. The president's going to have to exercise legislation. You probably remember there's specific law that allows the president to, for example, part of the big challenge for the weapons labs for building, what is it, PF4 and some of these other, facilities they need is, the environmental regulations are, they go beyond just ensuring that we don't have nuclear waste that runs off into streams and stuff like that. So some of the federal requirements make it almost impossible to build the capabilities that are required. So the president can say, you know what, and technically on federal land, you don't have to abide by that to begin with. So there are things that the military can do, that DOE can do, where they just say, hey, listen, this is a national security issue, and as such, we're going to waive a lot of these requirements, and you can build what you need to build. So it's part of recognizing, it's sort of like Alcoholics Anonymous. The first thing you have to do is recognize that you have a problem. And so when the United States recognizes that we have a problem, we can then begin to address it. And it's going to take an almost Manhattan Project-like effort to get the country back to where we are, because for those, I'm sure most people here have been watching it, and they see that we're making almost no progress. And then I think we're going to have you have had so much emphasis in NNSA and in DOE on non-proliferation, counter-proliferation, arms control, that I don't know how many within DOE in particular actually want us to build new capabilities and expand what we have. And I'm not sure if we have the right folks in place to make sure that we, when we sort of get on the ball and are doing this at the speed and tempo we need to, that we have the people in place who are like, yes, that's what we got to do. Let's make it happen. So you've got several problems to fix.
Yeah, and I would add to this that, I find it hard to believe that Chinese and Russians can build hypersonic glide vehicles and we can't. It's because we won't. It's because we don't want to. It's not a priority for us. So once we fix that, then I believe that we can do the other things. President Biden reminds us all the time, right? We're the United States of America. We can do anything we want to do if we put our minds to it, right? So it has to become a priority, and that's the biggest challenge. And to go to the modernization era, we're 15 years into a 30-plus year modernization program, and we still don't have any new metal on the flight line or in the silos. And no wonder the American people are frustrated, and no wonder our adversaries are expanding and growing. They're trying to get it done while they can, so those things matter in that regard. Dr. Karshner put out 3 good questions. I'm not sure we can get to all 3, but I did want to at least get to the first one. And he says, hey, parity may not be enough to provide leverage to revive arms control. And I think the answer to that is, you might be right. But let me tell you what hasn't worked. Everything we're doing today, is not getting them to the negotiating table. Okay. And so our argument with dynamic parity is it's time to do something different. And we believe that the one way to get them to the table is to convince them that the threat to them is big enough that it's time to negotiate. That's how we got to the INF Treaty. When Reagan placed those Glickums and Pershing twos, that became an intolerable risk that Moscow had to deal with, and so they chose to negotiate. And so I would argue that that is maybe the same vein of what we're seeking to do. If we make it clear, we communicate well that we are not seeking superiority, we are only going to match their numbers. I believe that we can get there. There is a sense of fairness in this regard, and again, it goes to the argument I made in my opening comments. We must stop accepting that a capability or a capacity that our adversary has is somehow not destabilizing. But when we pursue that capability or capacity, it now all of a sudden becomes destabilizing. And so I just that just does not compute in my little mind. And so I would encourage that part of what needs to change in the business as usual response is that we must accept that we have to deal with the increased risk. And I suppose my parry to that is stop accepting the increased risk.
Yeah, I mean, parity, I think his second point, parity is in the eye of the beholder, is accurate. So it's, and I'll guarantee you that the Russians and the Chinese will never see anything we do, or at least they will never say that what we're doing is what we say it's intended for, because that's what they do, right? They're never going to say, yeah, the Americans are right, it works the way they want. That's just not who they are, and it's never what they're going to do.
That's right.
So it's not a issue I worry that much about. And then for your third question, I'm not sure what to say about it. I don't necessarily know that I have a good answer. Do you, Curtis?
So I think, again, parity will be in the eye of the beholder of the ally. I think many allies are concerned that we don't have enough capacity to cover down for them. That's why assurance is failing in some of these states. And so I think if we add numbers and capabilities for some of these exquisite scenarios, that they will become more assured. We are certainly not credible when the answer to every problem is a giant hammer. So we have to come up with other ways, and also the answer to every problem isn't a series of paper cuts, via conventional weapons and economic sanctions. So we have to be able to deter across the spectrum with weapons and capabilities that are across the spectrum. In order to ensure that the adversary is deterred and the ally is sufficiently assured.
Let me answer Emily's question real quick. I know we're out of time, but I see your question there, Emily, in the chat, and I would submit to you that we have experience with both the Russians and the Chinese, and they've had arsenals, for the Russians since 1949 and the Chinese since, 1964. So the idea that they're going to necessarily build and that we'll have this perpetual arms race, well, we didn't have that before. There came a point where, who was it? Harold Brown said, we build, they build, we stop, they build. Well, we stopped because we said, we don't need to build anymore. And then eventually the Russians stopped because they thought, building more does no good. And so you're probably going to reach a point where everyone says, building more does you no good. There's enough that we can cause the kind of devastation, that will destroy everything. And then everybody will be, sit happy and will avoid war. And that's really, in the end, that's the point. The point is to never allow the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans to think that they can join forces to coerce or defeat us. And so therefore, for them to never seek conventional or even, limited use of nuclear weapons. Because right now, I promise you, I know for a fact that they're looking at conventional use of nuclear weapons, low yield, small numbers, because they understand we don't have the capability and they think they can get away with it. So we have to reset that baseline. And if that means that we say, hey, we're going after symmetry, and then they say, oh, well, then we have to build more, we'll eventually level out at something. And then that will be a sort of stable balance right there.
So let me add to that real quickly. So on the premise of Emily's question, though, I would argue that the purpose of dynamic parity is never to seek numerical advantage. It is seek equal advantage, balance. And we'll use our national technical means, maybe other verification measures to come up with that number. And then you be open and public about it. And so the idea is to overcome those arguments. With regard to arms racing, they are arms racing, we are not. And our point here with dynamic parity is that when you don't arms race, you are creating an asymmetrical problem where you're on the wrong end of that equation. And so it is time to begin to catch up. We call it arms reacting in the dynamic parity strategy. We are not racing, we are reacting. And because we are not seeking superiority. The goal right now is to seek superiority as a collective. And so if we continue to ignore that, time will run out, and we'll find ourselves in a position where we will be blackmailed and coerced into becoming a middle power. And so that's the goal, is to not let that happen.
All right. Thank you very much, Curtis and Adam, for the dynamic parity. And Peter, any final words there?
No, I just want to thank Adam and Curtis for a very, very creative discussion. America is facing some very serious challenges, not just from Russia and China, but internally as to how do we think about nuclear deterrence now? And that is going to be we have to, I think Stratcom definitely is of the view we're going to try to find out from the best minds available what we can do. But I've also heard from others that other parts of the government don't have the urgency, which the Posture Commission talked about how quickly we need to do this. And I think the Posture Commission was right about this. And this is an attempt with Adam and Curtis and the whole series we're doing is to help folks think about these issues and formulate a policy that'll be bipartisan, that'll last a long time, and that works. So again, Curtis and Adam, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
And to our president, James Petrosky, any final words or no? Okay.
You're muted,
So
Jim.
and this dynamic parity is just the beginning. There's going to be more reports, more details, and this is just the start of a new conversation, and hopefully it'll materialize into actual metal in the silos that Curtis referred to. And September 13, Friday the 13th, 10 a.m. tentatively, we have Huessy Rubin, and he'll be in a different time zone, but it'll be fine for him and for us. So we hope to hear from him Friday the 13th, 10 a.m. So that's when we see you here at the NIDS and Peter Huessy seminar. And thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.